And good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to see you. Thank you very much for joining me once again. Happy Thursday evening to you all. For those of you who are new, I'm Hari-kirtana. I hope that doesn't come as too much of a surprise to you if you are new to the webinar. And I'm very, very happy to have you all here with me this evening. My mission, should I decide to accept it, is to share keys to understanding the Bhagavad-gita with you, unlock the secrets of the Gita that are hiding in plain sight. If you want to understand the Gita and see how you may be able to apply the teachings of the Gita in a very practical way in your life, you are in the right place. And if you can hear the sound of my voice, please click the little raise your hand button just to make sure, just so that I know that you can hear me. And there you are, waving your hands. Thank you. All righty. That means everyone can hear me. So you can go ahead and put your hands back down. If you have a question, there's a Q&A box that you should be also able to see. And if you type in a question or a comment, then I will keep my eyes out for your questions and comments. If you choose to register a complaint, I will probably ignore you. But go ahead, give it a shot. You never know. That's our part of our housekeeping. Let's go to the rest of our housekeeping. I'm going to share my screen with you. Here we go. So you know how to raise your hands. You can adjust your audio settings up in the upper right-hand corner. You don't need to worry about your microphone or your video camera, should you have one, because you can see and hear me, but I cannot see or hear you. Only through the Q&A box is that possible for me. You can also adjust your viewing options. And as I said, please, any questions or comments that you have, go ahead and type those into the Q&A box and I will keep my eyes peeled for them. Last week, we concluded our chapter on Karma Yoga, specifically on Karma Yoga, chapter 3. This entire section is the first 6 chapters is officially about Karma Yoga. However, as we move deeper into this section, are also going to cover the eightfold path of mystic yoga, otherwise known as the yoga system of Patanjali. We're not quite there yet. We wrapped up with how we harmonize action to nature, to the nature of the world, to our own nature, how we harmonize our conditioned nature with our constitutional nature, harmonize our conditioned and constitutional nature with the nature of the world in reality. We also spoke about the all-devouring enemy of mankind and how to reason your way beyond the reasoning mind. So those were the concluding verses of chapter 3. Tonight, very exciting transition into chapter 4. Chapter 4 is we're going to see a major shift in Krishna's program. It is called the Yoga of Knowledge. We begin with the methodology through which transcendental knowledge is transmitted. And Krishna will explain a little bit about himself in some more detail. Specifically, he will speak about why he shows up. And we're going to look at his explanation of himself and see what we can learn from Krishna's explanation of himself. Tonight, we are going to cover chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. But first, I've been reading a book, and it's, well, on my screen, it's backwards. All right, so raise your hand if this book seems backwards to you. Let me know, because there may be some trick I can do to turn it around. Okay, nobody's raising their hand. So now raise your hand if this book reads properly. Looks fine. Everybody raises your hand. Oh, okay. So I'm the only one that's got this backwards. Interesting. Well, you learn a little bit more about webinar technology every day. So now you know that the name of this book is not but Falling Upward, and it's by Richard Rohr. A friend of mine had recommended this book to me some time back. This book was published in 2011, and because the glare of the lights reflects back into the camera, I am now attempting to do something I don't normally do. I'm attempting to read a book without my glasses. I might be able to pull this off. Let's just see. As I got this book, what the book is about the two halves of one's life, and how the way you live and learn and what you learn in the first half of your life is not necessarily the same as what you do with the second half of your life, particularly how the second half of your life is different from the first half of your life from a spiritual perspective, and why it's good to know that this is or should be the case, even if you have not yet reached the second half of your life, which I have. Now, I'm reading just one line to you that kind of was stopped me in my tracks. And this is very early on in the book. We're still in Roman numerals in this portion, where Richard Rohr, whose work I really like and who I admire as a spiritual teacher, writes something that I take issue with. He writes, quote, "All spiritual language is by necessity metaphor and symbol." And then he goes on to speak about how the truth is revealed through people, and the light that is shining through people who are capable of shining spiritual light comes from somewhere else, doesn't come from us. We are conduits. One way to think about it is we are transparent mediums through which spiritual light is projected, through which it shines. I agree with that part. But the idea that spiritual language is by necessity metaphor and symbol, all language, all spiritual language is metaphor and symbol, I'm not so sure I accept that. At least insofar as I don't think that it's limited to that. Granted, there are problems with language when you speak about things beyond the material realm, which is to say that language points us in the direction of something spiritual, but unless it is transcendental sound, it may not necessarily be that thing to which it is pointing. Nevertheless, we need language in order to have a map, to know where we're going, to be able to recognize spirituality when we see it, because we have to hear some kind of a description of what it looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like, what it smells like, what it tastes like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We assume that ancient texts of spiritual knowledge are symbolic, especially when we get to things that really challenge our notion of what is real or what is possible, what an intelligent, educated person is likely or willing to accept. And that's about to come into play as we enter into this fourth chapter of the Bhagavad-gita, where Krishna will simultaneously establish his credibility as a speaker of transcendental knowledge and undermine his credibility as a real person who actually exists or existed. Let's just see how that happens. As is our usual program, I will read the English translations of the verses that we're going to cover this evening. We're going to chant one of them in the Sanskrit, call and response. And then I'm going to go back and we're going to look at each verse one at a time and go a little bit deeper into the significance of each of these verses. So here we go. Chapter 4, text number 1. Krishna begins. The Blessed Lord said, I taught this imperishable science of yoga to Vivishvan. Vivishvan spoke it to Manu, and Manu in turn taught it to Ikshvaku. Verse 2. Visionary kings received this supreme science through a chain of disciplic succession. Over the course of time, this succession was broken, and thus the science of yoga has been lost, O subduer of enemies, Arjuna. Text 3. Today, I am teaching you this same ancient science of yoga. I am revealing this transcendental mystery to you because you are my devotee as well as my friend. Text number 4. Arjuna said, Vivishvan is senior by birth to you. How am I to understand that in the beginning you instructed this science to him? Text 5. The Blessed Lord Krishna said, you and I have passed through many births. I remember all of them, O subduer of the enemy. You do not. Verse 6. Although I am by my very nature unborn, imperishable, and the Lord of all living beings, I appear in every millennium by my own power, standing within and yet presiding over my material energy. Text 7. O descendant of Bharat, whenever and wherever righteousness declines and irreligion ascends, at that time I personally appear. Verse 8. To protect the saintly and destroy the wicked, as well as to reestablish the principles of religion, I appear millennium after millennium. Verse 9. O Arjuna, one who knows the truth about the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving their body, take birth again in this material world. They come to me instead. So quite a lot in 9 verses. So now let's look at each of these verses one at a shot, one at a time. So again, verse 1, the Blessed Lord said, I taught this imperishable science of yoga to Vivishvan. Vivishvan spoke it to Manu, and Manu in turn taught it to Ikshvaku. So here are a few things that immediately pop up here. First of all, Krishna characterizes this science of yoga as imperishable. It's pretty common practice to hear yoga teachers say yoga is a 5,000-year-old practice. And it's also common to hear yoga teachers who are conversant with the history of yoga say that most of what we think of as yoga today, which is to say the physical practice, is actually very recent. The physical practice only having been developed in the last 100 or so years, or more if you go back to the Hatha yogis and the tantric yogis of the 11th to 12th centuries, still all fairly recent, by which I mean 5,000 years ago, in terms of how the Vedic tradition from which the Bhagavad-gita comes calculates time. That actually was not very long ago either. So here Krishna is saying this imperishable science, which is to say, it's always been around and will always be around. Yoga never goes out of fashion. So that's the first interesting thing here. The idea that yoga does not come into being any more than we come into being. You may recall that the very first lesson imparted by Krishna to Arjuna is that we are not created beings. We do not come into being at a point in time. There is no possibility that we will ever go out of being at a point in time. And like us, the science of yoga, of understanding the true nature of the eternal self, who is currently residing in a temporary material body, that is also something that is not created at some point in time. Now, the next obvious question here is, who is Vivashvan? And who is Manu? And who is Ikshvaku? And why is that important? Why should we care about these people and the fact that Krishna spoke the knowledge of the Bhagavad-gita to them at some prior point in time? So Vivashvan is Surya, the sun god. And that takes us right back to the idea that spiritual language by necessity is symbolic or metaphorical or allegorical or anything but something to be taken literally, because everyone knows there's no sun god, there's no tooth fairy, there's no Santa Claus. If your children are listening, I'm sorry to be Mr. Buzzkill. Oh well. Except for one thing, there's a sun god. How do I know this? Well, I've not seen the sun god, so I can't tell you that by direct perception I have seen the sun god, therefore I know there's a sun god. However, by both logic and verbal testimony, 2 out of 3 of the ways in which one can acquire knowledge, according to Patanjali, at least in his Yoga Sutras, I can make a reasonable assertion that there is a sun god. You know, when we look for life on other planets, we look for carbon-based life forms. We look for water on a planet to see if it's possible that a carbon-based life form made of water might exist on that planet, because we're looking for life as we know it. Well, what about life as we don't know it? We live on the Earth planet with bodies made mostly of water and earth, carbon. Why would people living on the sun not have bodies made of fire? Of course, you can't see them. That doesn't mean they're not there. There are plenty of things you can't see that are there. And if you think about it, you know this. So you certainly cannot say that there is no possibility of a person who is basically the president of the solar system, who's in charge of the thing that makes everything possible, including the planets in the solar system. And Vivashvan, this sun god, the guy in charge of making sure the sun comes up on time in the right place every day, spoke it to Manu. Manu, the word Manu is the origin of the word man, or mankind. And he's responsible for filling up the world with human beings, or mankind. And Ikshvaku is his son, who also has some job in the maintenance of cosmic order. All right, so now if you look these folks up and you find out when different yoga wisdom texts tell us that these folks were around. Oop, jumping the gun here. All right, then you can do a little bit of arithmetic here. Manu, according to yoga wisdom texts, Manu spoke the Bhagavad-gita to his son, Ikshvaku, who at the time was the king of planet Earth, 2,005,000 years ago. So we can say on the basis of this verbal testimony, if we accept the authority of yoga wisdom texts, that the Bhagavad-gita has been extant in human society for about 2 million years. And before that, Krishna spoke to the sun god, who appears at the beginning. This is why Arjuna, when he asked about this, he said, wait a minute, at the beginning you spoke to the sun god? Well, that would be 120,400,000 years ago. So according to Puranic time, we have 4 seasons of time. The Satya Yuga, which is the period of time dominated by the mode of goodness, which lasts for 1,728,000 years. Treta Yuga is the next yuga, where a little bit of the mode of passion creeps in, and you have 1,296,000 years of that. In these previous yugas, by the way, it is said that people lived for much longer periods of time, 100,000 years in Satya Yuga, 10,000 years in Treta Yuga. Dvarpa Yuga becomes a little more degraded. It only lasts for 864,000 years, and people are said to live for about 1,000 years. Which sounds familiar if you've checked in with the Old Testament lately. We have Abraham and people in his general time frame living for about that long. And then Kali Yuga lasts only 432,000 years, of which 5,000 years have passed. And Krishna speaks the Bhagavad-gita to Arjuna on the battlefield at the start of Kali Yuga, just as we were about to begin Kali Yuga there 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And that's when things start to get written down because people can't remember anything anymore. And that's where you get this idea that yoga is a 5,000-year-old practice. So that is where that comes from. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, is this credible? Is all spiritual language necessarily metaphor and symbol? Is this mythology now that we've gotten into? Or can one make a rational case for this kind of time frame for the Bhagavad-gita? If not, what happens to Krishna's authority as the speaker of the Bhagavad-gita? Is he now relegated to mythology, or in other words, not real? Or can we accept Krishna on his own terms as he speaks about himself in the Bhagavad-gita, namely as the supreme person who personally shows up in order to reestablish the science of yoga when that science, due to the influence of time, is lost? I will leave it to you to consider this particular question. If you have a question about this first opening verse, then go ahead and pop that question into the Q&A field, and I will keep my eyes out for it. But I spent a little extra time on this verse specifically because it immediately challenges our credulity. And for most reasonable thinking people, we now have to question are we going to accept this just as it is? Or are we going to interpret this in some way or something so that it matches our conception of reality rather than expands our conception of reality to include something that most people would simply dismiss as primitive thinking? So if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A field. Meanwhile, we're going to move on to the next verse, verse number 2, and that is the verse that we are going to chant. So I will back up. Okay. So we're chanting this verse because this is also a very, very key verse for understanding the Bhagavad-gita and the system through which transcendental knowledge is traditionally transmitted. So here we go. I'm going to chant one line at a time. You're going to chant back. If you're new to the diacritical marks in the transliterated Sanskrit, the accent mark over the S is an SH sound, but way back in the back of your mouth, as opposed to sh. The bar over the vowels means they are held longer and are very open in their sound. The dot under the H at the end of a word, at the end of the line, means you echo the vowel that precedes it back. And dots under vowels mean that you pronounce them a little further back in your mouth than you might otherwise. The dot under the S in particular is a regular SH sound. So here we go. I chant, you chant back. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Evam Parampara Praptam Imam Rajarshayo Viduhu Sakale Nehamahata Yogo Nashta Parantapa. Very good. Our translation again. Visionary kings received this supreme science through a chain of disciplic succession. Over the course of time, this succession was broken, and thus the science of yoga has been lost, O subduer of enemies. So disciplic succession is a translation of the phrase parampara. Literally, that means one after the other. So one way to vet a teacher is to find out what disciplic succession or lineage of teachers they're connected to. And I suppose that means that you ought to be vetting me if you're coming to the webinar. What is my connection to a lineage? Well, I've got one. The technical term for the particular lineage that I am connected to is the Brahma Madhva Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, which means that I have been instructed on the science of the Bhagavad-gita by a teacher who's connected to a teacher who's connected to a teacher who learned from a teacher who learned from a teacher, going back into antiquity, presumably all the way back to Brahma, the very first living being created in the universe. From the standpoint of what is historically verifiable, Madhva is recognized as one of the founders of the founder of one of the four Vaishnava Sampradaya. Vaishnava means one who is a devotee of Vishnu or Krishna. Gaudiya indicates Sri Chaitanya, who appears in the line of disciplic succession from Madhva, and that Chaitanya appears just about 500 years ago. So you can jump back to my teacher, his teacher, several teachers back through 500 years to Chaitanya, back several hundred years more to Madhva, and so on up the line. And what I'm sharing with you is what I've learned from my teachers. I'm trying not to make stuff up. The other interesting thing about this translation is the idea of visionary kings or seers, kings who are also sages, wise kings. The social system of the Bhagavad-gita is something we're going to cover next week, because Krishna will speak another verse that really specifically addresses not just kings, but all four of the social divisions that the Bhagavad-gita will refer to going forward from this point. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that and the role of visionary kings within this social structure next week. So there's your cliffhanger, your reason to show back up next week. And the other part of this that's interesting is the idea of, over the course of time, the power of time whittles away at everything, including knowledge of yoga. And every so often, that knowledge has to be reestablished. In relatively short order, spiritual traditions need renovation, just like kitchens. It is great for its time, and then 20 years later, that dishwasher is pretty old, that sink doesn't work quite as well as it used to, the ceiling is peeling, the cabinets don't close right anymore. It needs a renovation. The science of yoga is also like that. Spiritual science that is right for a particular time may not be exactly right for another time. Now, by this, what I mean is there are changeless principles and there are changeable details about how the principles are applied according to time, place, and circumstance. And it's absolutely imperative that one knows the difference between a changeless principle and a changeable detail. The failure to understand this difference means that either a spiritual tradition will become morbid with age, or it will regress into a kind of fundamentalism, where you try to apply the changeless principle absolutely, irrespective of changing circumstances. So Krishna recognizes that by the power of time, the science of yoga can get lost, or something happens to it, and therefore it needs to either be reestablished or renovated or something along those lines. And he is giving this as a reason for showing up. So in the next verse, Krishna says, "Today I am teaching you this same ancient science of yoga. I am revealing this transcendental mystery to you because you are my devotee as well as my friend." So Krishna is revealing this science. Therefore, we can understand that this is divine revelation, that the science of spiritual life is not something that we invent, not something that we make up, not something that we create for ourselves, not a product of imaginative thinking. It's revealed knowledge. if it is truly transcendental knowledge, then it has to come from some place other than the conditioned world, the not transcendental or mundane world. For example, if one is drowning in the ocean, the only way one is going to get out of the ocean is if a ship comes that is above the ocean, that is not affected by the ocean in the same way that we are. And someone on that ship can come and throw us a lifeline or a raft or a lifesaver or something and pull us out of the ocean. But someone who's also in the ocean and drowning cannot save us because they're in the same, well, not boat that we are. We're both waiting for the boat. So the Bhagavad-gita is the boat that is sailing to our rescue in order for us to escape from the ocean of material existence that would otherwise be impossible to extract ourselves from. Now, what's the qualification for receiving this revelation? The qualification is very specific. Krishna says, because you are my friend and my devotee, I'm telling you this. So here we have the qualification for understanding the Bhagavad-gita, for hearing it in the first place. And then, as Krishna will emphasize as we move through the Bhagavad-gita, for understanding it. Arjuna is Krishna's dear friend and his devotee as well. He is devoted to Krishna. So Krishna, being particularly inclined towards those who are friendly to him and people that he therefore cares especially about, he's equal to everyone, but he's also a person. And so by virtue of a personal relationship, Krishna is inspired to share what he knows. Now, in the next verse, Arjuna asks this question. Vivishvan is senior by birth to you. How am I to understand that in the beginning you instructed this science to him? In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali describes Ishvara as the teacher of the ancients, beyond the influence of time. And this is what this exchange is confirming insofar as Krishna is concerned. And it's a doubt-based question. Arjuna is not totally buying in to what Krishna is telling him at this point, in spite of the fact that he is favorably inclined as Krishna's friend and devotee. Still, he's not getting it, and he's got doubts about what he's hearing. So this is a doubt-based question. The faith-based questions will come later, but for the next few chapters, we're still going to get doubt-based questions from Arjuna. So if you have doubts, you're in good company. Arjuna also has doubts. Krishna's reply, you and I have passed through many births. I remember all of them. You, O subduer of the enemy, do not. So here Krishna begins to make a very clear distinction. The difference between Krishna and Arjuna is that Krishna is God and Arjuna is not. Krishna is omniscient, remembers everything in the past, knows everything that's going on in the present, and knows everything that will happen in the future. And Arjuna knows pretty much what's going on right now. And if his memory is anything like mine, then he doesn't remember what happened yesterday. We can certainly understand that we do not have this power of complete recollection of all of our past lives. In the next verse, Krishna gives a little more elaboration. Although I am by my very nature unborn, imperishable. Well, we are also unborn and imperishable. Well, actually, we are born. We're born into these material bodies. But Krishna is unborn, even though he appears. How can that be? Imperishable, and the Lord of all living beings. See, here he just says flat out, I am the Param Ishvara, is the particular phrase that he uses here, the supreme Ishvara, the ultimate Lord of all beings. So he just says flat out who he is. So even though that's who he is and that's his nature, still, he says, I appear in every millennium by my own inner power. Now, this is really significant because you and I did not appear in our current lives by our own inner power. We were forced to come here by our karma. We had some say in the matter only insofar as we are experiencing a reaction to our past actions. We created our destiny by our use of free will. However, those actions generate reactions according to a law of material nature that we do not control. And therefore, the birth we have in this life is given to us, not entirely a product of our own power. Ask yourself, if your appearance in the world was entirely a matter of your own power, is this the life you would have chosen? Is this the body that you would have chosen? I personally can think of a million things I would have changed. Okay, so he shows up every millennium by my own inner power, standing within and yet presiding over my material energy. So here's the very far out thing that Krishna is getting at here. He's unborn. His form, his body is not like our bodies. We are born into material bodies. Krishna is not. He is standing within the material world, and yet he is not controlled by the material world the way we are controlled by the material world. In the Brahma Samhita, the song of Brahma, he begins by declaring Krishna's position as Ishvara Parama Krishna Satchit Ananda Vigraha, meaning Krishna is the Parama Ishvara, or the paramount Lord. Satchit Ananda Vigraha. Vigraha means form. His form is made of eternality, complete cognition, and perfect feeling or bliss. Not a material body made of earth, water, fire, air, and ether, mind, intelligence, and ego, but rather a form that is made of eternality, knowledge, and bliss, which is also a challenge insofar as language is concerned, because how can we wrap our heads around a form that's made of these things? Well, this language is not symbolic language. It's indicative language. It's language that points us in the direction of what it means to be spiritual, to experience spirituality. But until we actually develop our own spiritual senses, we will not really understand the meaning of these words. So, not just symbolic, more than symbolic. Anadir Adir Govinda. Govinda, another name for Krishna. Sarva Karana Karanam. Anadir Adir Govinda. Govinda has no cause other than himself, self-causing. In other words, that person who has no cause other than themselves, that person is the supreme being. Because if there was any cause for that being to be, then whatever that cause was would be the supreme being or thing. So there's not an infinite regress in yoga philosophy. Eventually, it rolls back to one being. Nityo Nityanam Chaitanas Chaitananam is a verse, part of a verse in the Katha Upanishad that also describes that amongst all the innumerable conscious beings, there's one conscious being who is the supplier of all the necessities of life to all of the others. So same idea. Sarva Karana Karanam, the original cause of all other causes, or the first cause, the first domino in the row of dominoes that gets knocked over. So unlike us, Krishna is not, or at least he's telling us that he is not under the influence of the qualities of material nature that affect us, that he is actually still in control of the material world, even though he appears to be moving within it. So this is part of the magic of Krishna. Next verse. O descendant of Bharat, whenever and wherever righteousness declines and irreligion ascends, at that time I personally appear. So we spoke about this in previous episodes, the idea that according to the Bhagavad-gita, there's a supreme being who cares about us so much that every so often he will personally show up in order to show us where the trail of breadcrumbs is so that we can follow it to a complete understanding of our true spiritual nature, the nature of the world, etc. The next verse is kind of a companion verse. 8. To protect the saintly and destroy the wicked, as well as to reestablish the principles of religion, as opposed to establish a religion, which we have also spoken about in previous episodes. The idea that yoga is not a religion, that the Bhagavad-gita is not Hinduism, that Hinduism, along with every other temporary condition of religion or race or nationality, etc., would be considered an upadhi, a temporary material condition. But rather, universal principles of religion are what are being spoken of in the Bhagavad-gita. So, to reestablish the principles of religion, I appear millennium after millennium. So now, this is something I hope that you will discuss on the Facebook page. For those of you who are new to the webinar, we also have a Facebook group, Bhagavad-gita Satsang. You will get the link to that Facebook page. If you're on Facebook, you'll be able to get to it via the newsletter that I will send out tomorrow with the links to the recording and the links to all the other recordings that have gone before this one. And here's what I would like you to bat around. Whose concept of saintliness and wickedness are we talking about here? Because remember, I'm not the only person who likes the Bhagavad-gita. You're not the only person who's interested in the Bhagavad-gita. Steve Bannon really likes the Bhagavad-gita. And he uses the Bhagavad-gita as a rationale for what he does. And for those of you who don't know me all that well, that's not what I do. It's nothing like what I do. And I don't think about the Bhagavad-gita the same way that Steve Bannon does. Nevertheless, we have this idea that one person's saintly is another person's wicked. How are we supposed to work with this? I will leave it to you to discuss. How are we to understand what the universal principles of religion are that determine who is actually saintly and who is actually wicked? Of course, as we move through the Bhagavad-gita, this will come back. But let's play with this for a bit. Okay, our last verse. O Arjuna, one who knows the truth about the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving their body, take birth again in this material world. They come to me instead. So the transcendental nature of Krishna's appearance and activities is what I've been talking about as we've moved through these verses, the idea that he doesn't have a material body. He has a body made of pure spiritual stuff. that he is transcendental to this material world, even though he moves within the material world for the sake of fulfilling his mission. And if we understand that, that's enough. Just that is enough for us to achieve liberation from the karmic obligation to take birth in the material world again. That's pretty far out. And instead of taking birth in the material world, we can come to Krishna. Well, where is that? Where does Krishna hang out when he's not here in the material world? I mean, this implies that there's somewhere to go where Krishna's hanging out. And we can hang out with him. Where would that be? On the battlefield? I don't think so. My guru's guru came up with a phrase, back to Godhead. And then that was augmented by my Param Guru, my grand guru, is go back home, back to Godhead. And that phrase, which I have heard by my virtue of my connection to the disciplic succession of which I am a part, describes the idea that just as there is a material world, there is also a spiritual world, that this material world is a kind of shadow, upside down and backwards, messed up reflection of a spiritual reality, which is to say that just as I have a name, I have a form, I have qualities, and I do things, I have relationships. Similarly, there is a spiritual environment within which people who are fully self-realized and not taking birth in this material world, but rather appearing in their spiritual form, made of the same Satchidananda, eternality, knowledge, and bliss, as Krishna's form, can hang out with one another and with Krishna, have relationships, engage in activities. Qualitatively, we are the same as Krishna insofar as we're made of ultimately the same spiritual stuff, and consciousness is the symptom of that presence of the spiritual stuff that animates these material bodies. Quantitatively, however, we're not the same, as we've already discussed. We don't remember all of our past lives. We're not omniscient. We're not unaffected by time, at least in our current situation. Therefore, if we can be affected by the material world, then there's a difference between us and the Supreme Person, Krishna. So, to be a person means to have senses. And to be a spiritual person, therefore, means to have spiritual senses. And the coherent organization of senses is a form or a body. And persons are, by definition, social. We are defined as persons in relationship to other persons. And therefore, that requires an environment within which people can engage in relationships. And to get to that state of being able to engage in eternal spiritual relationships, the only qualification, apparently, according to Krishna here, is that one understands the truth about the transcendental nature of his appearance and his activities. And there you have it. Tonight's program, the Yoga of Knowledge, kicks off with the first 9 verses. We've spoken about the transmission of transcendental knowledge, the reason for Krishna's appearance. We've also spoken about the qualification for hearing the revelation of the Bhagavad-gita and the qualification for freedom from the obligation to take birth again in the material world. And as we move forward, we'll speak about whether or not that relieves us of our obligation to engage with the material world. or not. All right. Here's your big chance to ask a question. I'm sitting on the edge of my meditation cushion, waiting for your questions or comments. And while I am doing that, I will remind you that if questions come later or you want to talk to me later, then you can write to me at Hari-kirtana.com. The book I referenced earlier this evening, which I will reference again next week, because there's another portion, larger portion that I've read in this book that really pertains to what we're going to do next week. Falling Upward, A Spirituality for the Two Halves, Two Halves of Life by Richard Rohr. And we're going to look at this. Oh, this is the quote. See, I was so clever that I've now foreshadowed what I'm going to tell you about in this book next week. I'm so clever, I fool myself sometimes. Anyway, here's your quote. Both Plato and Jefferson said that democracy was not really the best form of government. It was just the safest. A truly wise monarch would probably be the most effective at getting things done. That's quite a statement. And we're going to look at how that statement relates to what Krishna is going to speak about in the next few verses of the Bhagavad-gita. Write to me. I'm always thrilled and anxious to hear from you. So Hari at Hari-kirtana.com is the place where you can do that. Coming up this weekend, I am going to be in beautiful downtown Frederick, Maryland at Sol Yoga for Yoga Sutras Immersion Weekend. If you are in the Frederick area and would like to join me for that, there is still time to register. That will be from 12 to 7 with an hour break in between on Saturday and Sunday. We're really going to look at the Yoga Sutras in detail, talking about an overview of the sutras and then the psychology of yoga, yoga as a moral philosophy, yoga as a mystic science, and the theology of yoga. Later this month, I will be returning once again to Cumberland, Maryland, the Gilchrist Museum, for a weekend of sharing yoga philosophy. That is to say, how do we do that? How do we share yoga philosophy with other yogis, either as a friend or as a colleague or as a yoga teacher teaching yoga students? Next week, we will continue with chapter 4. We'll speak about consistent principles of spiritual life, the unlimited varieties of reciprocation that are possible between an individual spiritual being and the supreme spiritual being. And we'll talk about modeling spiritual behavior of sadhus, people who are practicing sadhana on the path of spiritual life. We will cover verses 10 through 15. All right, that's all, folks. Last call for questions. Thank you very, very much for joining me this evening or joining me whenever you have watched or listened to this webinar. If you are going to be joining us after the fact, I deeply appreciate your choosing to spend this time with me, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Have a nice night. End meeting for all.